Hello, everyone. My name is Anshul. I'm your host. And today, with me in Policy Jam, I have Aditya Thomas. Aditya is an electrical and electronics engineer, and his career turned him towards, as likes to call, a reluctant software engineer. Aditya has more than a decade of experience in wireless and wireline space, spanning software engineering, technical management, and product development. He's also has always been has a keen interest in technology policy, and recently he had taken a plunge and to explore technology policy more by joining a graduate course in technology policy at Takshashila Institute, and that's where I met Aditya, and that's what we got into conversation, and we thought it would be good to record an episode on some of the things that we are learning and exploring in the field of public policy and technology policy. So welcome, Aditya. It's great to catch up with you. I'm very excited and looking forward to this conversation today.
Thank you, Anshul. Very happy to be here.
Great. So what we've planned for this podcast episode is focus on something called digital public infrastructure, and then look at it from some of the concepts which we have learned. Some of our talk will also be, based. We'll be picking up some ideas from a book by Rahul Matthan, which is called The Third Way, which both of us have read and we liked it a lot. So I think that's a good foundation. Yeah, so that's the book which Aditya is showing. So yeah, let's get started. Aditya, let's talk about public goods, infrastructure, and then how does it translate it to something called DPI?
So first, let's think about what is a public good. That's something we sort of spoke a lot over our sessions at Takshashila. So essentially, it is something that has externalities, in the sense that it could be both positive or negative. Like, essentially, it's not any one person or person's choice to how to use it. Other people's choice affects them. It could also, public goods also could be those which could lead to, the potential of market failure, in the sense that the provision of these goods may not be possible by the market. So entities like the government or the state would have to step in. And what are the other characteristics of public goods, Anshul?
So some of the two things which the classical definition of a public good is something which is non-rival and non-excludable, right? So for example, clean air. Clean air is non-rival. My usage of a clean air does not diminish your usage of clean air. Similarly, when a new child is born, let's say in India, in a city like Bangalore, where the air is still relatively clean, that child gets to enjoy the benefit of a clean air. There is no way to exclude that child from drawing benefits from clean air. So that's the definition of a public good. So clean air is an example of a public good. National security, law and order, these are some of the things which fall in the category of public good. So you want to talk about infrastructure, public infrastructure?
Yes. Yeah. Public infrastructure is essentially for example, a road is a public infrastructure. So what does it mean? What does it mean that, okay, everybody can use the road. You cannot stop, a public road, you cannot stop other people from using the road. And though your use of the road does not hamper anybody else.
Right.
So in that sense, this is a public good. It is a physical infrastructure. So maybe we can start thinking about move this definition of infrastructure to the digital space, where we start thinking about digital infrastructure, or maybe even just digital public infrastructure, DPI.
Right.
So when we talk about digital public infrastructure, what sort of comes to your mind, Anshul?
So going by all the public discourse around digital public infrastructure, for example, UPI is one clear example in Indian context, which is often taken as the biggest or the brightest example of digital public infrastructure. But from a classical economist and public policy point of view, the experts have a differing opinion that digital, so the UPI, something like a UPI is not necessarily a public good. You cannot really call it a public good. And of course, in public discourse, it is not being referred as public good, but somehow people, when they say digital public infrastructure, they want, in their minds, they are still thinking about public goods. So they are still thinking about the characteristics of a public good, and they are trying to think that digital public infrastructure is something similar. But they're still keeping the names, the nomenclature different. But still, digital public infrastructure, I think it doesn't find, that word itself doesn't find itself anywhere in the textbooks or literature, or the classical definition in the field of economics or public policy. So I think that's where the confusion is arising. It's a new term coined, right? And it's pretty new.
Okay. So is your are you saying that the way India has sort of implemented the UPI makes it not a digital public infrastructure, or there is no concept like digital public infrastructure?
So if we go by definition of something like a public good, right? And if we try to think about digital public infrastructure from the lens of a public good, it seems to serve some purpose, that it is open to everybody, and government and the state has spent money in building this infrastructure, and everybody is taking a benefit from this. But when we come to the second definition of non-exclusivity, so to some sense, I, as an Indian citizen, if I don't take an Aadhaar card, I cannot really use UPI, right? I need to have Aadhaar number. So there is some level of coercion there, that first I need to apply for an Aadhaar. If I don't have an Aadhaar, I am by default, by definition, excluded from using that infrastructure. Second is from a vendor side. If somebody wants to, for example, you need to have a banking license, a payments banking license, then only you can actually build your services on top of UPI. Otherwise, you're not allowed to. So that's second thing. Of course, the role of free market was in a way not it's not really free market based. So there is still a monopoly over it. Government or state has built UPI, and there is no other player who's allowed to change or make changes or propose a new framework. So it is again a top-down approach towards to the whole idea of UPI. So that kind of conflicts somewhat with the definition of public goods and public, but still it has its merits. And especially in Rahul Matthan's book, there are a lot of insights on how this DPI has been well thought through. It has been developed by people, technologists, and they have done it in the context of Indian market, Indian citizens. So it has been built very well, but of course, the basic idea, it still defeats the basic idea that it is not open to modification of the forces of free market and innovation. So there is still a question of how much innovation will happen in this space in UPI over next 10, 20 years. It's not a short-term game. It has been built for next 50 years. But will it actually survive or serve its purpose in next 5 decades? That's a question that still remains kind of unanswered.
So I was just like to push back on that definition, and this is like just sort of trying to clarify my intuitions around both public goods, public infrastructure, and why DPI wouldn't be a public good.
Okay.
So let's go back to our example that we spoke about let's say the road being a public good. Now, if I want to drive on this road, I need to have a license.
Right.
Which would, in some sense, translate to the fact that if you want to be on the DPI, you need to have some sort of identity. In India, it's Aadhaar.
Right.
That's the consumer side. Now, if you look at it from the car manufacturer side, there is also some compliance that they have to do. For example, you just cannot put a vehicle on the road.
Right.
It has to be homologated for India.
Right.
You have to comply with pollution certificates.
Right.
The various crash certificates,
right.
crash worthiness certificates. I just like some sort of think things through as to why DPI, whether it is how DPI has been implemented in India, or there is no concept of DPI.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just curious as to what you think about it.
Yeah, those are some of the fine nuances, which I think my thoughts are still kind of muddy. But yeah, those are fine points that you've raised. I don't really have specific insights on that. And that's why this is a debatable topic. You'll find reasoning from both the sides. But as I said, I don't really have that much of a nuance on that. I've not really built this, is just still trying to understand this whole space.
Yes, and I'm also trying to build my intuitions around this. But like you said, I think even though it's perhaps not a public good, it's perhaps useful to think of it in some sense as a public good and think about, okay, the reasons why it could not be a public good and what are the fallout from that.
Right. Right. So I think this is a good point where we could move to the topic of how US and Europe, they have approached this whole idea of data governance, and how DPI in India has in some way tackled this problem differently from US and Europe.
Yeah. So broadly, I mean, like I think this is one of the core thesis of Matthan's book is basically the third way that it's different from what the US has done. It's different from what the EU has done. So broadly, the US follows essentially a laissez-faire approach. Okay. I mean, like security is important, cybersecurity is important, and liability laws are strict. But within that framework, they can do whatever they want.
Yes.
Okay, they can offer whatever services they want.
Right.
They can interoperate with only certain banks and not with other banks.
Right.
Some banks form a consortium and only you can transfer money between them.
Right.
It's improving in the sense now. I mean, like within the last 5 years, there are these apps which help you transfer money. And again, the payment system is developed by the app. Okay? It's not something mandated by the government.
Right.
Then and okay, so that's the US. So what you have any thoughts on that before we go to Europe?
No, go ahead. Let's move to. So yeah,
So
one point is, as you said, it's US has taken in a way a lenient approach. They have hands-off approach that let the market figure it out, right, completely. But if you think about it, if you're building, again, going back to the definition of public goods, if you leave everything to the market, in public goods, when there are certain positive externalities, you cannot expect the market to solve this. So markets and the private firms will underinvest in this because there is an element of a positive externality. So maybe US approach is not completely right. But in the light of that, how Europe has responded?
see, Europe has gone the other extreme and sort of legislated that there is one system for. I'm not particularly clear, but I believe that okay, the transfer between like individuals is sort of governed. I mean, they have various rules and regulations, but maybe you can talk because I have less experience with the EU than with the US.
Okay.
Do you have? I mean, basically, I can just describe what Matthan talks in the book, where the EU system is
Please go ahead.
excessively regulated.
Yeah.
And what India tries to do is sort of, I wouldn't say a happy medium, but somewhere in between both the two.
Right.
And it's a balancing act. Do you just do a laissez-faire approach where you can say companies do it, or do you say, okay, there's only going to be like one specific way? So what India has done broadly is that the protocol for this transfer is open. In the sense, any payment entity can transfer to another payment entity, but how to get onto this road, okay, or this digital infrastructure for transferring this money and sort of verifying identity is determined by the government, specifically, I think the RBI.
Right. So I remember somebody was saying that when you go, so he was traveling to Europe, and then when he open his mobile phone and he try to access websites or try to use some services, online services, book something, order something. And everywhere he would have to click on multiple times. He would have to click on accept, I accept, and consent and giving consent. And it was a big friction for him. So he said, for every small thing, they would, at a granular level, they would start asking for your consent that now I am accepting this information. Now I'm accepting. So that GDPR thing, which came up, it has been there for quite some time in Europe. It was, it gave a feeling of, being very, very intrusive, not intrusive, but very creating a lot of friction for the user. So that's where US, but as you said, it's like an extreme approach to what US has taken, and now India is somewhere in between. So with DPI and the another piece of that India. So the way I think Rahul described in his book, which I really like, the new term policy as a code, right? So they have thought through this is that it's like the compliance will be built in the code. So you don't have to worry about it. The participants in the ecosystem, if they plug into the ecosystem, they have to comply to the protocol, and then protocol will take care of the fact that it is compliant, which is a very interesting approach. So the whole the DEPA framework, right? The data empowerment protection architecture, and around which this idea of account aggregators, which has come up, which is very interesting, and it has been in India for some time, and I'm sure this will, this third way, which Rahul talks about in his book, will probably be adopted by other countries and other economies as well. But I don't know. I heard that UK tried to do something like Aadhaar, and they had a proposal, and they choose not to do it because there was issues around state being aware, or the state surveillance and privacy issues. So citizens pushed back and they didn't do it. But in India, it was started as a means for welfare scheme, and then slowly it converted coercive action where everybody had to get enrolled, because the way now, if you want to open a bank account, you need an Aadhaar, right? Without that, it is just not possible. And it is, again, in India, it's gone into other extreme where for every small thing you are asked for an Aadhaar, which is by law is not required, but it's just that how the Indian society or the market and has responded, because now everybody has Aadhaar card, all the businesses and even a lot of government. I remember, I mean, recently my kids' school, they asked for an Aadhaar, and the law says they cannot ask for Aadhaar for this purpose. And then when I pushed back and asked them, why are you asking? They showed me that Karnataka government has come up with a rule where in a lot of schools, they give free meals to students, right? So they want to, it's not being misused. So they're asking for children's Aadhaar number. Now, of course, in my daughter's school, there's no such scheme. But since it is a cookie cutter approach that every school has to provide, they are asking for it. And now that's right there is a conflict, right? One place the law says you cannot ask for Aadhaar, but people are just asking, and their awareness is not there. So that's one thing, right? Would you like to put some light on?
Sorry, go ahead.
So I thought we'll probably move to a little bit discussing about the DEPA framework, the account aggregation. But before that, if you have some more thoughts on this, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to, yes, I mean, probably as I mean, career software engineers, this sort of lens of thinking about it as, I mean, basically your protocol as code, okay, is something that sort of resonated with me.
Right.
But though, as you say, I mean, like, okay, going beyond that, if in general, if the state has a tool for surveillance, I think they are going to use it. I mean, if you have a hammer, yeah, every problem becomes a nail.
Right.
So, yeah, there's always that problem. And I think civil society, there should be pushback. I think there were a court case where they have there was a lot of pushback because before, even for getting a SIM card, you had to provide the Aadhaar.
Right. Right.
I think I mean, clearly said, I mean, the state can ask you for it, but private people cannot. But then I guess it's so ingrained in our over the last few years, it's so ingrained in our psyche that I mean, when people ask, we just
Yeah,
give it.
yeah,
And I mean, funnily, I think it's basically I think my Aadhaar number is out there, so I don't think there's very much use if I say any longer that okay, I'm not going to give it to
right.
you. Because only very recently, and I think part of the whole uh, thinking about public policy over the last 3 months that Sheila's sort of asked me to think. I mean, it taught me to think about these things a little more. But otherwise, if somebody asks you for the other, I just say, okay, here you are. Here's a photocopy. You never know where my photocopy is got. Okay.
Right, right.
Um,
You
yeah.
so
But yeah. Sorry.
Aadhaar has all these mechanisms and features available. For example, for a long time, I did not know that you could download an Aadhaar card with your Aadhaar masked, right? So you could just download an Aadhaar card. If you want to show it to somebody, the Aadhaar number would be masked. So first 8 digits would be masked. So that way, in some way, it is protected. Similarly, you could generate a virtual Aadhaar number, right? So that, and whosoever asks for it, you give that virtual, they will do the validation, whatever, and then you can revoke it later, change it later. So that way there is a the technology is, but it's just that people are not aware of it. So
Mm-hmm.
the reason, so they have thought through it, which is good. Right. So yeah, so let's talk about DEPA.
Yes, I mean, I just want to, before we go to DEPA, I just want to just ask you, I mean, what do you think about, I mean, since the design of Aadhaar, okay, yeah, the sort of legislation is cool and stuff, but fact that it is the one entity that manages this, I mean, what do you think about in respect for innovation,
Yes.
uh,
So
which might be problematic?
true, true. I remember a few days back, I wrote a blog post called "The HD Wars and the Sound of Innovation." So
Mm-hmm.
in that, I kind of explored the idea of how standards evolve uh, organically when in a free market.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the
Mm-hmm.
of um, the encoding standards, video encoding standards, right? There was a
Mm-hmm.
I am not recollecting the name. There was one backed by Sony and one backed by Microsoft, I think. There were two standards, Blu-ray and something else. And ultimately
Mm-hmm.
they won. And it was just like a arms race. Some people were on this side, some people on that side, and somehow markets finally one winner emerged organically. It was not top-down approach, but it was like a bottoms up. And that's how any innovation happens. So one of the books that is probably you could call it as the Bible of public policy in India, Ajay Shah and Vijay Kelkar's book, In Service.
Mm-hmm.
I think that book also starts with the example of the charger, right? Mobile charger, wherein
USB, yeah.
charger, right? What if you C-type charger, if government says, just like government has come up, state has come up with a protocol standard for UPI and NPCI. For example, they would say that, standard charger C-type has to be used. And just imagine
Mm-hmm.
what the problems around it will be happening. So in case of NPCI, um, I don't know if such problems have emerged because everybody was coerced into it. But if you would have given
Mm-hmm.
market a chance, for example, if PayPal was given a chance to come to India and implement that instant payment, real-time payment solution, I'm sure with PayPal, few other players would have come in, some Indian banks or some Indian startup would have pitched in, and organically a standard would have emerged. So that would have driven the innovation further, and that's why the concerns around over the next 5 decades, how will UPI evolve? Will it actually evolve because the control is still with the state? They will hold the
Right.
protocols and standards. So yeah, that's where the concern is.
And yeah, interestingly, when you bring about this, the evolution of UPI and the fact that you don't have private players, and this is, I think, I heard about this podcast from you, where I mean, I think it's Shah and another person, where they talk about this UPI, the fact that UPI doesn't even have a business model.
Right, right,
You basically saying, okay, you have private entities providing the service, and they're doing it out of the good of their heart.
right, right.
Okay. So, I mean, and that is why, I mean, like you see, like Google Pay provides this, and they try to do a lot of things. I mean, provide you some rewards and stuff like that to try and get a little bit more about your activities in some way to sort of like maybe trying to monetize your behavior.
Right.
Whereas if they were actually making a small amount with every transaction to cover their infrastructure costs and to make a small profit, I mean, you could be almost assured that, okay, they would be careful to increase the number of customers on their platform and probably innovate so that people don't move to another platform.
Right. Right.
I think this is the podcast is everything is everything.
That's right. Amit Verma and Ajay Shah. Right.
Amit Varma and Ajay Shah. And I think you had it on your profile or something like that. And that's how I came to know about it.
Yes, yes.
And they had a specific episode on GPI.
Right, right. Recently, they recorded an episode, and that was a wonderful episode. I would strongly recommend the audience and listeners and viewers of this podcast to check out Everything is Everything. And they have done some 50 episodes, and every episode is a gem. I
Mm-hmm.
watched them 2 to 3 times. There's so much information and dense
Right.
insights packed into it. Right. Right. So the big idea in Rahul Matthan's book, which I really found very interesting, was about DEPA, the Data Empowerment and Protection Architecture in context in India. So the one fundamental problem with data privacy or the data, consumer data or user data, is that there are all these big silos of data. So these big tech companies, for example, Google or Facebook, they when they as they say, right, when you are not paying for the product, you are the product. So when we
Mm-hmm.
use all these free
Yeah.
services, they will collect all this data, they will do user profiling, and then based on that, they will do user targeting for their ads and whatever, right? That's where their main business model is based on. But there's still a problem there. Initially, there was casual attitude towards it. They were just so there was this whole case of Cambridge Analytica, where it was the users' data was used, it was sold to a third party by Facebook to Cambridge Analytica, and then of course it was used for swaying the election results around Brexit, which was a big case of how data privacy violation, right? So then came the idea of how users should have a certain control on their data. So today, if I want to tell Google that delete all my data, there should be some way in Google settings that I should go and just tell Google delete all my data. Similarly with Facebook, of course, they say that they have the certain features and settings, but it's very hard to figure it out, and even for a user to understand that. For most user, the attitude is okay.
Mm-hmm.
They have my data. What's the big deal? At max or at worst, what they will do is show me some targeted ads, which is not really a big deal. But when we really think about second and third order consequences, data privacy is a big issue. Now the whole idea of data silos, and if I want to control and own my data, there should be a way for me to get back all the data from all these big companies and maybe have a consolidated view of data at one place, so that if somebody else asks for this data from me, I can maybe give a temporary access, which is pretty much impossible for a user to do it at his own level, right? Nobody has the time, inclination, resources to do this. So that's where this data aggregation idea comes into picture, and which fits in very well with the whole idea in India's financial ecosystem is probably a very good use case, wherein, let's say, with UPI, a lot of transactional data is being generated. So even with the small vendors, right? Now, if that vendor wants to avail a credit from a financial institution, there was no way for him to do it, because there was no credit card access to this small lower income group people, right? For us it is very easy to get a credit card, but for them it's hard. So now they have a trail of transactions in their bank account because they are doing this UPI transactions. Now if a third party like a credit provider wants to access the data, typically what they would do is they would go to the bank and ask for it. So then bank has really no incentive to provide this data. So probably the way they
Mm-hmm.
would provide would be not standardized. So now that data transfer from bank to the credit provider, this is all again the same idea of data silos, right? Transaction
Mm-hmm.
from bank and another bank, with, let's say the vendor is doing some e-commerce transaction on Amazon, so his transaction history is lying with Amazon, with some other e-commerce platform. So now there comes an idea of so I as a user is a data principal, right? A bank who has a credit, my bank transaction, that bank is a data, so I'm a data principal. Uh, that bank is a data fiduciary. And there comes a third entity, which is called the consent manager, or in another terms, they're also referred to as aggregator, right? They will become a middleman kind of person between us. But this is all embedded in the technology protocol, right? So if I want to give my data to a third party, a credit provider, I will request the consent manager. So the credit provider will request the consent manager, the middleman, that I want Anshul's data from his HDFC bank. So the consent manager will send the request to me. I'll say, okay, I approve this. Then the request will go to bank. Bank will send the data to the consent manager. Bank also doesn't know who the data is going to, right? It doesn't know that maybe, let's say Paytm is providing some kind of credit, right? So the data is going to, Anshul's data is going to Paytm, the bank doesn't know. So it's like, again, nobody. So there is a huge, great amount of privacy here. So none of this third party knows where the data is flowing. Only the consent, even the consent manager also in a way doesn't know, because it is all encrypted, just like in WhatsApp. WhatsApp doesn't know what I'm sending it to you. Only you and I are privy to it. So this whole idea of three people in between, consent manager in between, and all this data flow is driven by protocols. This is an amazing setup. So one of the company, for example, Setu, it's doing that, right? They are playing the role of account aggregator or the consent manager. So that's a brilliant design, which I think will fuel India's financial ecosystem, the credit system for people who really need it.
Yeah, and I think this also goes back to what Matthan said, the third way, where you sort of, this code is sort of the legislating this. I mean, reducing the friction, seeing that things are private, rather than coming from saying that these are the things a certain entity has to do. And I think this sort of, I wouldn't say it's open in the same, it has the same, I mean, it's sort of the same architecture as the UPI, where only certain entities that can enter into the system. But basically, any bank can enter into it. So there is, I mean, it sort of reduces the friction in transfer of your personal data to other places from one entity to another, while still maintaining privacy.
Right. Yeah. So that way, DEPA is, I feel it's really, and again, I don't know if I can call it an innovation, because it's still a top-down approach, but still it's pretty awesome. But if they just open it up for like an open source, if this just open it up, maybe a more innovation can happen on top of it. So yeah, let's see how this space evolves. I have heard news, I've read in media that there are quite a few countries who are interested in adopting India's DPI, including the Aadhaar and the UPI, and of course the DEPA framework. Let's see how it flows. So financial system is one place. Another could be healthcare system, right? Wherein when from one hospital to another hospital, you've got your X-ray done in one clinic, you've got your MRI done in another clinic, and that data is lying with two different entities. If you're consulting a third doctor, he wants that data, and there is no really, clean way to get all the data from all these different entities to the doctor. So once all these healthcare system starts plugging into this DEPA framework, the DEPA ecosystem, things will become much more smooth, and innovation will still happen, but within the boundaries of the protocol, right? Within the constraints of the protocol. So that's a part of it. For example, in Rahul's book, he gives the example of the soundbox, which is their small vendors. So again, so recently, so okay, let me talk about the soundbox thing, right? So you are aware of it. You go to a vendor, do a UPI transaction. Now the vendor doesn't really know whether the money has come into my bank, right? There were cases where people will just show him a screenshot, an old screenshot, and the vendor would think that my money has come. And of course, there was a
Mm-hmm.
problem of literacy, because people were not, small time vegetable vendor would not know what's written on the screen, whether money has come or not. So they invented this sound box. All they had to do is just plug in with, and that's on top of that UPI layer, and it worked. So that was one innovation. But then there is another counterpoint to it. I was talking to one of my friend who actually told me about this public policy course in Takshashila. So I had met him few
Okay.
months back, and he had a mixed view on this. He said earlier, when you would do a credit card transaction, right? You would go to a vendor, you would show him tap a credit card, and transaction is done. You don't need to have internet connectivity. Only the vendor needs to have an internet connectivity. Now, when you go, you also need to have internet connectivity, and the vendor also needs to have internet connectivity, because
Mm-hmm.
it's a transaction and then he needs to get notified. So in a way, you have increased the friction. So that was an interesting way to think about it, right? Earlier, one of the transacting entities could be offline and it would still work.
Right, right.
Now both need to be online.
That's actually quite interesting, and I never actually thought of that.
Yeah.
Though perhaps the fact that almost all of us have smartphones
Yes.
sort of, in some sense, sort of
Given,
mitigates that.
right, right. So it's given. So that's why one of the important points of any government or state scheme, when you are saying that Aadhaar had been launched primarily with the intention of direct benefits and welfare, 50 to 60% of Indian population survives on state welfare. And that was the intention of the Aadhaar. But then if you go to a lot of, it was not completely inclusive in that sense, because there's still a lot of labors wherein their thumbprints are not clear, right? So it would fail. The biometric authentication will fail, and it was as high as 20% in some cases. It was failing.
Okay.
There was a problem of internet connectivity in a lot of places. For example, in Northeast, right, where you are delivering a welfare, but then to receive that welfare, you need to have some kind of internet connectivity where the person is authenticating himself with the Aadhaar system, and there is no internet connectivity. Then how do you do it, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the whole in the idea of inclusive launching an inclusive scheme, that was questionable to a certain extent. So those are some of the open questions which I still have not understood completely, but those were interesting insights.
And that's interesting that you raise these questions because, like, yeah, it's when you design these things, I mean, I think my perspective is just that from my point of view, yeah, I mean, these are not things that I would ever think of, but like, as a policymaker, you have to consider all the stakeholders who might use your system rather than just a few of them.
So have you thought about this whole idea of digital public infrastructure in light of your experience working in, you know, electronics, your background as electronics engineer?
Not really, because this is my sort of first tryst with actual tech policy. Uh, because my background is in telecommunications.
Okay.
And again, so it was like I was working on modem protocols. So essentially, I was implementing a protocol,
Right.
which would essentially like basically it's not between two phones, but between your phone and let's say you have an Airtel SIM, it's talking to Airtel,
Hmm.
the Airtel equipment,
Right.
right? So this whole idea about code as protocol is not new, but the sort of lens that it brings in when you actually think about it, when you talk about in terms of policy, is I think quite powerful and something that's really resonates.
Right. And uh, what I wanted to quickly also explore, I think I wanted to do it at the beginning of the episode, but let's do it anyway. I would be very
Yeah.
curious how you got interested in the field of public and tech policy specifically. What prompted you, or what motivated you to explore this field?
Well, it's hard to pinpoint one or two things, but I think one thing, I mean, I would is an article I read maybe a couple of years ago. So this is about how China got into, I mean, got into the 5G ecosystem.
Okay.
So now what happens is when you have when you have your phone and your equipment provider are communicating, there are
Okay.
certain codes or communication coding, okay, in the sense that encryption codes which sort of manipulate the bits, and these have to be very high performant. So for the 5G standard, I mean, there was a lot of, I mean, again, this is policy making is messy,
Yeah.
where on the phone side, it was a code that was the West followed. Okay, it's called LDPC.
Okay.
And whereas on the equipment side, it is something that China proposed called
Okay.
polar codes. And how they got it is a fascinating story. So the person who developed these codes was, I think, a East European scientist.
Okay.
And they managed to get him and bring him to, I think it was Huawei. And they sort of developed this based on his papers.
Hmm.
And I mean, again, this is maybe 2 or 3 years ago. But what struck me when I read this is I have actually worked on Chinese on the Chinese modem stack when I was with Samsung.
Hmm.
And at that point of time, China was using a slightly different standard for this was for 4G,
Okay.
right? Where there they did not have any innovation, but just the fact that China had such a big market, even a top equipment vendor like a phone manufacturer like Samsung was willing to create this, I mean, or implement and test the separate standard just for them. So then I realized, I mean, this is such a long-term effort, how they have sort of like climbed into the telecommunications market.
Okay.
First, they used, I mean, like, and it's not just suddenly they did it. I mean, this is 2012, 2013 that I'm talking about, where they sort of like, okay, use their market size to bring these manufacturers and said, okay, no, you guys have to create phones. We are going to create a separate standard. And you guys have to create phones which fit our standard.
Hmm.
Basically, it's to so that they don't have to pay royalties to Qualcomm.
Right.
And 10 years or no, 5 years down the line, they were actually able to actually innovate,
Hmm.
okay, and come up with their own standards. And of
Right.
course, I'm not sure whether there is any lessons for India here.
Hmm.
But this is something I realized, okay, this is, like at that time when I was doing it, it was just like, okay, yeah, this is work, let me do it. But sort of thinking about the higher things that, okay, why certain standards are used. And go back to your case of HDMI, like
Right.
why certain standards, I mean, it's not that one standard is better than the other. It's just a lot of politics
Right.
and sort of discussion and kind of come with a compromise. And I think, I mean, that is one of the things that, I mean, like when you ask me, like what sort of like sparked your interest in policy and thinking about much more than just the engineering side of thing, that is one of the things that come to mind.
Great. That's very interesting. For me, I can clearly pinpoint the time when I got interested. I got interested in public policy from the show that we just mentioned earlier in this episode. Everything is everything. I somehow
Yeah.
found that on YouTube and started listening to it. And of course, insights from Ajay Shah were just they just blew my mind. I had never thought about it. For me, thinking about the world from the lens of public policy had never happened. I had just been never explored that area. So the way I thought about our country, India, policy making, how state works, how markets work, the interaction, the complexities, that was very fascinating to me. And that's how I got started. And then of course I found Takshashila and the GCPP and the whole bunch of people who are thinking in these directions. Quite fascinating.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm quite happy to have taken the course. I've met you,
Yeah.
come on this podcast
Yes, yes.
and talk about things that interest us.
Great, great. So great, Aditya. Thank you for your time. And I think we can, before I end this, I would just, so let's catch up again. Maybe today we, bounced few ideas around DPI. But I think the whole world of public policy and tech policy is so big that as we keep on exploring, learning new ideas, we would have more to share and learn from each other. And that's the whole, I think my idea of starting this podcast was to bring in the whole discussion of public policy in public discourse, even in a very small way. Even if one or two people who watch this podcast, if they get interested, for example, the way I got interested, and they start exploring
Mm-hmm.
one by one over next few decades, it will probably snowball into a bigger impact, right? So that's my bit,
Yes,
my way, and thank you for helping me doing this. I would love to catch up with you again, and maybe we could do a few more episodes on policy.
I would definitely love to speak with you again as we continue on our journey in understanding
Great.
policy and sort of applying it to or thinking about it as how it affects our not just our communities but again our country and nation.
Awesome. Thanks for your time, Aditya, and I'll
Thank you.